The battlefield lay in eerie silence after the chaos of the day had subsided, smoke drifting low across shattered houses and splintered fences. Soviet soldiers moved carefully through the ruins, searching for any survivors or hidden enemies, their senses sharpened by exhaustion and instinct. Among them was Ivan, a young fighter, hardened by weeks of combat, yet still carrying the weight of each loss and each victory on his shoulders. His orders were clear: comb through the outskirts and make sure no German soldier remained. With his rifle clutched tightly, he advanced over the debris, boots crunching against shards of brick and frozen ground. Suddenly, he noticed a faint stirring near the base of a broken wall. Alert, he raised his weapon and moved closer, ready to fire at the slightest threat. Lying half-buried beneath rubble was a figure clad in the familiar gray-green uniform of the enemy. At first glance, Ivan assumed the soldier was dead like so many others, but then he saw a shallow rise and fall of the chest. The sniper was alive. He crouched low, scanning for traps or hidden weapons, and carefully pried the rifle from the figure's grasp. He knew snipers were deadly and often the last to surrender, yet the soldier's weakness made him hesitate. The prisoner groaned softly, and Ivan realized he would need to search the body to ensure no concealed weapon remained. With a steady hand, he reached for the heavy coat buttons, tugging them open one by one, expecting only to find the hardened face of another merciless adversary. But as the coat fell apart, Ivan's heart jolted. Beneath the worn military fabric was not the rough image of a grizzled soldier, but the unmistakable face of a young woman. Her hair was tucked beneath the cap, her skin pale from cold and exhaustion, her lips pressed tightly as if bracing against his gaze. For an instant, Ivan froze, unable to reconcile the reality before him with the image of the ruthless sniper he had prepared to despise. She stared back at him with eyes wide and clear, carrying a defiance that seemed to fight against her trembling frame. Shock rooted him to the spot. He had been taught to think of the enemy as shadows, as faceless machines of destruction. Yet here lay someone fragile, human, and utterly real. Her uniform may have declared her as his foe, but the vulnerability in her expression made that truth unbearably complex. The moment stretched as he held the coat aside, his breath clouding in the frigid air. A part of him whispered that it did not matter if she was man or woman, friend or stranger, because she had been aiming at his comrades only hours ago. Another part, buried deep but powerful, insisted that what he saw now was not an enemy, but a person caught in the same merciless current of war. His hesitation allowed his eyes to notice more detail. Her shoulder was soaked with dark blood, a wound barely staunched by a scrap of cloth hastily tied beneath her uniform. She shifted weakly, clutching at her chest as if to preserve some measure of dignity in front of him. The sight of her pain broke through the rigid shell he had built around himself. Without thinking, Ivan tore a strip from his scarf and pressed it firmly against the wound. She gasped and tried to push his hand away, her strength too little to resist. He muttered softly, words she likely did not understand, but the tone of compassion reached her more than the meaning. Her breathing steadied slightly, though suspicion lingered in her gaze. As he worked clumsily to bind the injury, his fingers brushed against the inside of her coat and caught on a small piece of paper. Curious, he pulled it free and unfolded it. His breath caught when he saw a photograph of a young boy smiling awkwardly in front of a modest farmhouse. For a moment, the war disappeared. and Ivan saw not a sniper, not an enemy, but a sister, or perhaps a mother, carrying memories of a life left behind. He imagined the boy waiting at home, unaware of where she was, unaware that she now lay wounded at the mercy of a stranger. The realization struck him harder than any bullet. She was not the faceless monster he had been taught to expect. She was someone's family, someone's hope, perhaps even someone's reason to keep living. The photo trembled in his hands before he quickly tucked it back into her coat, unwilling to let his comrades see. He met her eyes again and found them softened by confusion. Why was he helping her? She seemed to ask silently when every order demanded he treat her as the enemy. Ivan had no answer, only a feeling that to do otherwise would have been to lose the last piece of his own humanity. The evening deepened as the search patrol spread across the ruined village, calling out to one another as they secured the last positions. Ivan remained crouched beside the wounded sniper, his mind clouded with emotions he could not untangle. Duty told him to hand her over immediately, but some quiet force kept him there, ensuring she did not bleed to death in the cold. When she finally spoke, her voice was faint, strained, yet steady enough to carry meaning. Though Ivan could not understand the German words, he recognized the tone, half defensive and half pleading. He shook his head, replying softly in Russian, knowing she could not understand either. But the gentleness in his voice seemed to ease her fear. For a moment, they were two strangers, separated by language, yet connected by something older than words, the instinct to survive and to see the other as human. The sound of boots crunching through rubble alerted him to the arrival of comrades. Ivan quickly pulled her coat around her again, hiding the photograph, and rose to meet the approaching men. They asked if he had found anything, and he gestured to the prisoner. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Captured snipers were rarely shown mercy, yet orders required prisoners to be taken back for questioning. They bound her hands loosely, perhaps surprised at her youth, perhaps unsettled by her pale face. Ivan fell in step as they escorted her back toward their makeshift camp, his rifle slung over his shoulder, but his mind far from the duties of the march. He felt her eyes on him from time to time, searching for something she could not name. Each glance pierced deeper into his thoughts, leaving questions that had no place in war. That night, the campfire burned low, and the men spoke in hushed tones. Laughter was rare, replaced by stories of fallen comrades and speculation about what tomorrow might bring. Ivan Sarses, to part, polishing his rifle mechanically while his mind replayed the moment when he had unfastened her coat and discovered the truth beneath the uniform. The memory refused to fade, pressing against his chest until it became almost painful. He thought of the photograph again, of the boy's innocent smile, and wondered if somewhere a family waited for her as his own mother waited for him. He could not sleep, so he rose and walked quietly toward the section of camp where prisoners were kept. The guards nodded at him but did not question his presence. He approached the corner where she sat, her arms still bound, her head resting against the rough wood of the shed. She stirred when she sensed him near and lifted her gaze. In the dim light, her eyes seemed softer, stripped of the fierce glare she had carried when he first found her. For a long moment, they stared at one another without speaking, two lives caught on opposite sides of a cruel divide. Ivan knelt and offered her his canteen once more. She hesitated, then drank slowly, the water running down her cracked lips. When she finished, she returned the canteen, her hand brushing his for the briefest instant. The contact sent a shiver through him, a reminder that she was not a shadow, but flesh and blood, like himself. A strange calm settled between them, fragile but undeniable. In that silence, Ivan began to realize something he had never considered before. The war demanded hatred, demanded that he strip the enemy of their humanity in order to kill without hesitation. But sitting here, watching her struggle to keep her eyes open against exhaustion, he could no longer sustain that illusion. She was not an enemy in the pure sense. She was a person forced into the same pitiless struggle as he was. The revelation frightened him because it made the war infinitely more complicated. If she could be human, then perhaps they all were. He left her there, bound but alive, and returned to his post. The stars shone faintly overhead, cold and distant, while the earth beneath him carried the heavy weight of suffering. He lay awake until dawn, listening to the rustle of men turning in their sleep, and wondered what kind of world would exist once the fighting ended. The next morning, the prisoners were assembled to be marched to the rear for interrogation. She walked among them, weak from her wound, but keeping pace with quiet determination. Ivan found himself watching her, drawn by something he could not name. Just before they were led away, her gaze found his again. For a heartbeat, the world stilled, and in that gaze lay a message beyond language, a recognition that even in war, compassion could survive. Then she turned away, swallowed by the column of prisoners, leaving Ivan with the weight of their silent exchange. As he adjusted his rifle and prepared for another day of duty, he realized he would carry that moment with him for the rest of his life. Days passed, and the memory of the captured sniper lingered in Ivan's mind like a shadow he could not escape. The war dragged on relentlessly, each day filled with smoke, fire, and the cries of men who fell in battle. Yet even amid that endless cycle of violence, he often thought of the young woman in the grey coat and the silent message her eyes had carried. He did not know if she had survived the march to the rear or if the interrogators would treat her with any mercy, but the thought of her existence had already changed something inside him. In the following battles, Ivan fought with the same discipline and courage expected of him, but his heart no longer viewed the enemy as a nameless horde. Each rifle shot he fired weighed heavier than the last, for he could not help but imagine another photograph hidden in another coat, another family waiting for someone who might never return. His comrades noticed the shift in him, but said nothing, for they too carried private burdens and wounds of the soul. One evening, after a particularly brutal clash, Ivan found himself alone on watch as the stars spread faintly over the frozen land. He thought of home, of his mother's hands preparing bread, of his sister's laughter, and inevitably his mind drifted back to the girl whose life he had spared. He wondered if, somewhere across the lines, her thoughts might have returned to him, wondering why he had not treated her with the cruelty she had expected. That possibility gave him a fragile kind of hope, the idea that kindness could survive even between enemies. Months later, the war shifted, pushing the German forces back across the land they had once occupied. Villages were freed, though they lay in ruins, and each victory carried both pride and sorrow. In one such liberated town, Ivan stumbled upon a temporary holding camp for prisoners. Among the tired faces behind the wire fence, he saw Haywashur again. The sight stopped his breath, for though she was thinner and pale from captivity, he recognized her instantly. Their eyes met across the barrier, and in that moment the chaos of the war seemed to fall away. She did not speak, and neither did he, but the recognition was enough. She was alive. She managed the faintest nod, a gesture small yet filled with meaning, and Ivan returned it, his chest tight with relief he could not explain to anyone else. Duty soon pulled him away, and he never saw her again, but that brief reunion sealed the memory inside him forever. The war continued until its bitter end, and when at last silence replaced the thunder of guns, Ivan returned home. The world was scarred, the land broken, and his heart carried memories both heavy and tender. He told no one of the German sniper whose life had touched his own. It remained a secret he carried deep within, a reminder of the fragile humanity that could exist even in the darkest places. In later years, when he would sit by the fire and listen to children play in the safety of peace, he often thought back to that day in the ruined village, when he had unfastened the coat of his enemy and discovered not a faceless foe, but a young woman who looked back at him with fear and defiance. He realized then, and remembered always, that war was not only about victory or defeat, not only about nations or ideologies. It was about people, about lives shattered and lives spared, about moments where compassion could shine even against the backdrop of hate. He never knew what became of her after the war, whether she returned to her family or carried her own scars in silence, but he hoped she had found peace, just as he tried to find his. The memory of her eyes remained with him until the end of his days, a silent testament to the truth he had learned on the battlefield, that behind every uniform beats the heart of a human being, and that even in the most merciless war, humanity could still survive.